The sound of a whiskey bottle shattering against the wall jolted Katherine Newman from her fitful sleep, her husband's drunken rage having reached a new height on this bitter October night in 1878. Trembling fingers clutched the thin quilt to her chest as footsteps stomped through their ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of Julian, California, a once promising mining town that had seen better days since the gold rush fever had cooled. "Woman, where are you hiding?" Thaddeus's voice slurred through the darkness, his shadow looming in the doorway of their bedroom. At 26, Katherine had already lived several lifetimes of sorrow. The daughter of a banker from San Francisco, she had married Thaddeus Newman, believing his promises of prosperity and happiness. 5 years later, all that remained were broken dreams and bruised skin that she carefully concealed beneath her modest calico dresses. "I'm here, Thaddeus," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. His bloodshot eyes narrowed as he stumbled toward the bed. "Get dressed. We're going to town." "At this hour, it's nearly midnight." His hand came down hard on the bedpost. "Don't question me. Jasper Whitley has a fresh shipment of whiskey and I aim to have some." Katherine knew better than to argue. Jasper Whitley owned the largest saloon in Julian, a place where Thaddeus had lost most of their savings over the years. What little money they had left barely kept food on their table, and their small homestead was falling into disrepair. She dressed quickly in her plainest dress, pinning her auburn hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her hands trembled as she fastened each button, dreading whatever scheme her husband had concocted this time. The autumn air bit through her thin shawl as Thaddeus practically dragged her to their wagon. The horse, as thin and worn as Katherine herself, plodded wearily along the dirt road toward the lights of Julian. Main Street was quiet save for the glow and raucous laughter spilling from the prospector's fortune, Whitley's establishment. Katherine shivered, not entirely from the cold, as Thaddeus pulled her from the wagon and marched her through the batwing doors. The saloon fell momentarily silent as they entered. Katherine kept her eyes downcast, feeling the stares of the men gathered around the tables. She had rarely set foot in such an establishment, and the smell of tobacco, sweat, and whiskey made her stomach turn. Well, Thaddeus Newman," Jasper Whitley's voice boomed from behind the bar. "Didn't expect to see you tonight, especially not with your lovely wife." Thaddeus shoved Katherine forward. "I've come about that special reserve you mentioned last week." Whitley's eyes gleamed in the lamplight, his gaze traveling over Katherine in a way that made her skin crawl. "I recall. $50 a bottle. Pure Kentucky bourbon, aged 15 years. "I don't have $50, Thaddeus admitted, his fingers digging into Katherine's arm. "But I've got something better to trade." The saloon had grown quieter, men setting down their cards to watch the exchange. Katherine felt her heart begin to race as a terrible realization dawned. "Thaddeus," she whispered, "please, let's go home." He ignored her. "My wife. She's yours for the night, in exchange for 3 bottles. The horror of his words struck Katherine like a physical blow. She gasped, trying to pull away, but Thaddeus's grip only tightened. Whitley leaned forward, his thick mustache twitching with amusement. "That's quite an offer, Newman." "But what makes you think I'm interested?" "Look at her," Thaddeus slurred. "Daughter of Edward Hollister from San Francisco, educated, plays the piano, speaks French, worth more than 3 bottles if you ask me." Katherine's legs nearly gave way beneath her. Her father's name, once respected, now used as currency in this sordid transaction. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here, not in front of these men." "I must say that's a tempting offer," Whitley mused, reaching for a bottle. "Though usually, I prefer my transactions to be more permanent." A chair scraped across the wooden floor as a man stood from a corner table. Katherine hadn't noticed him before a tall figure whose face was partially shadowed by the brim of his hat. But as he stepped into the lamplight, she saw a pair of piercing blue eyes set in a weathered but handsome face. "That's enough, Whitley." His voice was deep, carrying an authority that seemed to command the room's attention. "The lady isn't merchandise to be bartered." Thaddeus whirled around, nearly losing his balance. "Mind your own business, stranger." The man stepped closer, and Katherine could now see him clearly, broad-shouldered in a dark duster, a gun belt sitting low on his hips. But it wasn't the weapon that made him imposing. It was the quiet confidence in his stance. "My name's Bryce Porter," he said calmly, "and I'm making this my business." Whitley chuckled. Now, Porter, a man has the right to do as he pleases with his property." "A woman isn't property," Porter replied, his gaze shifting briefly to Katherine. Something in that look respect perhaps gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. "Thaddeus," she said, her voice low but firm, "I will not be traded for whiskey. We're leaving." Her husband's face contorted with rage. "You'll do as I say." His hand rose and Katherine flinched, anticipating the blow that had become all too familiar. But it never came. Porter's hand shot out, catching Thaddeus's wrist mid-air. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." A tense silence fell over the saloon. Katherine could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as the two men faced off. Then Porter reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, tossing it onto the bar. $50, he said to Whitley, "for your special reserve." Whitley raised an eyebrow but picked up the pouch, weighing it in his palm before nodding. Porter turned to Thaddeus. "Here's your whiskey, Newman. Take it and go home. Alone." Thaddeus glared at him. "And my wife?" "I have a better proposition," Porter said, reaching into his coat again and withdrawing a folded document. "This deed to 40 acres just north of town. Good land with a creek running through it. I'll trade it to you for something you clearly don't value." Katherine stared in disbelief as Porter held out the deed. Thaddeus snatched it, unfolding it with unsteady hands. "This is worth more than she is," he muttered, his greed obvious. "Then we have a deal?" Porter asked. Thaddeus looked between the deed and Katherine, calculation in his bloodshot eyes. "Fine. She's yours. I'll take the land." Katherine felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her. In the span of minutes, she had been traded twice, once for whiskey and once for land. The humiliation burned through her veins, and for a moment she considered fleeing into the night. Porter must have sensed her thoughts. "Mrs. Newman," he said gently, "I have a proposition for you as well, if you'll hear it." She raised her chin, summoning what dignity she could. "It seems I have little choice in the matter, Mr. Porter." "On the contrary," he replied, "you have every choice." He withdrew another document from his coat. "This is the deed to a small homestead on the eastern edge of town. It's yours free and clear if you want it." Confusion replaced her anger. "I don't understand." "It's simple. Your husband has relinquished his claim on you, legally dubious as that may be. This land I'm offering belongs to you alone, not to him, not to me. You'll have a roof over your head and independence if that's what you choose." Katherine stared at the deed he held out. Her own land, her own home, freedom from Thaddeus. "Why would you do this?" she asked, suspicion clouding her gratitude. Porter's expression softened slightly. "Let's just say I've seen too many good people crushed by those who should protect them. The deed is yours, with no strings attached. What you do after tonight is entirely your decision." Thaddeus had already tucked the whiskey bottle under his arm, the deed to his new property clutched in his fist. "She's your problem now, Porter," he sneered, pushing past them and staggering out of the saloon. Katherine stood frozen, the enormity of what had just occurred washing over her. In a matter of minutes, her life had been completely upended. "Mrs. Newman," Porter said quietly, "there's a boarding house down the street run by a widow named Mrs. Hanson. She's a good woman. I can escort you there if you'd like." Katherine looked at the deed still in his outstretched hand, then at the man himself. There was nothing in his expression that suggested ulterior motives, only a compassion that seemed genuine. With trembling fingers, she took the document. "Thank you, Mr. Porter." As they stepped out into the cool night air, Katherine felt something unfamiliar stirring within her, a tiny spark of hope that had been absent for far too long. The widow Hanson's boarding house was a modest two-story structure with clean curtains in the windows and a small lamp burning by the door. Despite the late hour, Mrs. Hanson herself answered Bryce Porter's knock, her gray hair tucked neatly under a nightcap. "Mr. Porter," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "And who might this be?" "Mrs. Katherine Newman," Porter replied. "She needs a room if you have one available." Mrs. Hanson's kind eyes took in Katherine's disheveled appearance and the fading bruise visible at her wrist where her sleeve had slipped. Understanding passed across the older woman's face. "Of course, dear. Come in, come in. I always have room for a lady in need." Katherine turned to Porter, who remained on the porch. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Porter." "No need for thanks. The deed is in your handbag. Mrs. Hanson can help you understand the particulars tomorrow." He tipped his hat. "Good night, Mrs. Newman." As he turned to leave, Katherine called after him. "Will I see you again?" Porter paused, looking back with the hint of a smile. "Julian's a small town, Mrs. Newman. I reckon our paths might cross." With that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Katherine with more questions than answers about the mysterious man who had changed her fate with a single act of kindness. Mrs. Hanson led Katherine to a small but clean room on the second floor. "The washroom is at the end of the hall," she explained, lighting a lamp on the bedside table. "There's fresh water in the pitcher. We serve breakfast at 7, but given the circumstances, you're welcome to sleep as long as you need." "Thank you," Katherine said, the exhaustion of the evening finally catching up with her. "I'm afraid I have no way to pay you at the moment," but Mrs. Hanson waved away her concerns. "Any friend of Bryce Porter's is welcome here. He's done more for this town than most know." She patted Katherine's hand. "Rest now, dear. Tomorrow is a new day." When the door closed behind Mrs. Hanson, Katherine sank onto the edge of the bed, unfolding the deed Porter had given her. By the light of the lamp, she read the formal language that granted her ownership of 5 acres of land with a small cabin, located just east of Julian. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of bewilderment and cautious hope. For 5 years, she had endured Thaddeus's cruelty, watching as he gambled away her dowry and drank away what little remained of his own inheritance. She had stayed, believing she had nowhere else to go, no means to support herself. And now, a stranger had given her a chance at freedom. Katherine washed her face in the cool water, changed into the simple nightgown Mrs. Hanson had provided, and slipped beneath the clean sheets. As she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd known in years, she wondered about Bryce Porter, who he was, why he had intervened, and whether she would indeed see him again. Morning came with the gentle sound of activity downstairs, and the aroma of coffee and fresh bread wafting up to Katherine's room. She dressed in yesterday's clothes, smoothing the wrinkles as best she could, and made her way to the dining room where several other boarders were already seated. Mrs. Hanson greeted her warmly, introducing her simply as Mrs. Newman, our newest guest. No one asked questions, though Katherine noticed curious glances from the other lodgers, 2 elderly sisters and a young man who appeared to be a clerk of some kind. "I've taken the liberty of sending for some of your things," Mrs. Hanson said quietly as she poured Katherine a cup of coffee. "Mr. Porter stopped by early this morning and offered to ride out to your farm." Katherine nearly spilled her coffee. "He went to see Thaddeus. That could be dangerous." Mrs. Hanson smiled. "Don't worry about Bryce Porter. He can handle himself and your husband, I'm sure." As if summoned by their conversation, the front door opened, and Porter himself entered, carrying a small trunk. He set it down near the stairs and approached their table, removing his hat. "Mrs. Newman," he greeted her with a nod. "I hope you slept well." "I did, thank you," she replied, acutely aware of the other boarders watching with interest. "Mrs. Hanson says you went to Thaddeus's farm." "I did. He was in no state to object to my taking some of your belongings." Porter's expression revealed nothing of what that encounter might have entailed. "I've arranged for the rest of your things to be brought to your new property when you're ready." "My new property," Katherine repeated, the words still strange on her tongue. "Mr. Porter, I still don't understand why you would do this for me. That land must be valuable." He took a seat when Mrs. Hanson gestured for him to join them. "It is, but not as valuable as a person's freedom. I'd like to show you the property today if you're willing." Katherine hesitated only briefly. "Yes, I would like that." After breakfast, Katherine changed into one of her own dresses from the trunk. Porter had brought a simple blue cotton that was a welcome change from yesterday's rumpled attire. She found him waiting with a wagon out front, ready to take her to see her new home. As they drove through Julian, Katherine noticed people greeting Porter with respect, tipping their hats or calling out friendly hellos. He responded to each one by name, revealing a familiarity with the townsfolk that suggested he was more than just a passing visitor. "You seem well known here," she observed. Porter nodded. "I've lived in Julian for about 3 years. Came out west from Missouri after the war. The Civil War." Katherine asked, realizing he was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his mid-30s. "Yes, madam. Fought for the Union, then couldn't quite settle back into normal life." He guided the horses down a narrow road leading east. "Found my way here and decided to stay." "What do you do, Mr. Porter? Besides rescuing women from terrible situations, that is." The hint of a smile touched his lips. "I have some mining interests and a small ranch outside of town. Nothing grand." Katherine sensed there was more to his story, but she didn't press. After all, she barely knew this man, despite his kindness. They traveled for about 20 minutes before Porter slowed the wagon. "There it is," he said, pointing ahead. Katherine's breath caught in her throat. Nestled in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees stood a modest cabin with a covered porch. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone had been there recently. "I sent one of my ranch hands ahead to air it out and start a fire," Porter explained, noting her surprise. "It's been empty for a while." As they drew closer, Katherine could see that, while small, the cabin was well built and maintained. A vegetable garden, now dormant with the approach of winter, occupied one side of the yard. Behind the cabin, she glimpsed a small barn and chicken coop. "It's lovely," she said softly. Porter helped her down from the wagon. "It belonged to an old prospector who passed last spring. No family to claim it, so the property went to auction. I thought it might be useful someday. For situations like mine." Katherine asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. He met her gaze steadily. "For someone who needed a fresh start." They approached the cabin, and Porter opened the door for her. Inside was a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end, where a cheerful fire crackled. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, with a wooden table and 2 chairs set near a window that looked out over the property. A ladder led to a small loft where Katherine could see a bed with a patchwork quilt. "It's not much," Porter said, watching her reaction carefully. "It's perfect," Katherine replied honestly. After years in Thaddeus's decrepit farmhouse, this clean, solid cabin seemed like a palace. There's a well out back, and the creek runs year-round if that ever runs dry. The soil's good for growing, and there's enough pasture for a cow or a couple of horses. The previous owner left some tools in the barn, and the chicken coop just needs some new residents. Katherine turned slowly, taking it all in. "Mr. Porter, this is too generous. I can't accept such a gift." "It's not a gift," he said firmly. "It's yours by right. That deed is legal and binding. Whatever Thaddeus did last night trading you like property wasn't legal, but his relinquishing any claim to you in front of witnesses was. By law, you're free to own property in your own name now." As a divorced woman, the word felt scandalous on her tongue. As an independent woman, Porter corrected. "Whether you seek a formal divorce is your decision, but Thaddeus can't touch this land or anything on it. I've made sure of that." Katherine studied the man standing before her, steady, principled, yet somehow mysterious. "Why did you really help me, Mr. Porter? The truth, please." He was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes distant with memory. "My sister was married to a man like your husband," he finally said. "I was away fighting when he drank himself into a rage one night and beat her so badly she never woke up. By the time I came home, she was long buried, and he had moved on to another town, another woman." Katherine's hand flew to her mouth. "I'm so sorry." Porter's jaw tightened. "I tracked him for nearly a year before I found him in St. Louis, already remarried to a young woman who bore the same bruises my sister had hidden. I made sure he wouldn't hurt anyone else again." The implication hung in the air between them. Katherine didn't ask what had happened to the man she didn't need to. "When I saw your husband treating you that way," Porter continued, his voice softer now, "I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not again." His honesty touched something deep within Katherine, a recognition of shared pain, of wounds that might never fully heal but could perhaps fade with time. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. "And thank you for this place. I promise I'll make good use of it." Porter nodded, the intensity of the moment passing. "I've taken the liberty of arranging for supplies to be delivered tomorrow, enough food to see you through the next few weeks, some chickens for the coop, and seed for spring planting. Consider it an advance on the salary." "Salary?" Katherine repeated, confused. "I need someone to manage the accounts for my mining operation. Mrs. Hanson mentioned you were educated, and I recalled your husband saying you were a banker's daughter." Katherine's father had indeed insisted she learn bookkeeping alongside her more ladylike accomplishments, believing it would serve her well as a wealthy man's wife. "Yes, I'm familiar with accounting practices." "Then, I'm offering you employment, Mrs. Newman. 3 days a week at my office in town, fair wages paid promptly. If you're interested, that is." The prospect of earning her own money, of being truly independent, was almost overwhelming. Yes, I would be very interested, thank you." Porter smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "Good. You can start next week once you've settled in." He glanced around the cabin. "I should leave you to get acquainted with your new home, unless there's anything else you need." Katherine shook her head, still somewhat dazed by how drastically her life had changed in less than 24 hours. "I'll have the rest of your belongings brought over this afternoon," Porter said, moving toward the door. "Mrs. Hanson packed some provisions for today. They're in the wagon. And there's a loaded rifle above the door. Every homestead needs one." Katherine followed him outside, watching as he retrieved a basket from the wagon and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. "Mr. Porter," she said as he prepared to leave, You never told me what happened to your sister's husband's second wife, the one you saved." He paused, looking back at her with an unreadable expression. "She owns a successful millinery shop in Kansas City now. Married a good man, has 2 children." A small smile. "She sends me a new hat every Christmas." With that, he tipped his current hat, climbed into the wagon, and rode away, leaving Katherine standing on the porch of her very own home, watching until he disappeared around the bend in the road. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Katherine settled into her new life. True to his word, Porter had arranged for the delivery of supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, and smoked meats that would last through the coming winter months. 6 plump hens now scratched in the yard, providing fresh eggs daily, and Katherine had discovered a root cellar beneath the cabin, stocked with preserved fruits and vegetables from the previous summer's garden. Her first day at Porter's office in town had been intimidating but ultimately satisfying. Located above the general store, the modest suite of rooms served as headquarters for what Katherine discovered was a rather substantial mining operation. Porter owned controlling interest in 3 producing silver mines in the mountains surrounding Julian, as well as shares in several others. The account books were in reasonable order, though Katherine quickly identified several areas where improvements could be made. Porter had listened attentively to her suggestions, impressed by her knowledge and attention to detail. "Where did you learn double-entry bookkeeping?" he had asked, examining the new ledger system she proposed. "My father insisted I understand the family business," she explained. "He had no sons, and though he never said it directly, I believe he hoped I would marry someone who could take over the bank someday. Instead, you married Thaddeus." It wasn't a question, but Katherine answered anyway. "He was charming when he wanted to be, and persuasive. He convinced my father he had promising business prospects in mining country." Her voice had grown quiet. "By the time I realized the truth, we were already in Julian, and my father had passed away from influenza." Porter had said nothing, but his expression of quiet understanding had been more comforting than words. Now, as November turned to December and the mountains surrounding Julian received their first dusting of snow, Katherine found herself settling into a routine that brought unexpected contentment. 3 days a week, she worked in Porter's office, bringing order to his business affairs. The other days, she tended to her small homestead, learning through trial and error the skills needed for self-sufficiency. She had seen little of Thaddeus, which was a blessing. Word in town was that he had already lost the deed to the 40 acres in a poker game to Jasper Whitley, who had promptly sold it to a family newly arrived from the east. Thaddeus had reportedly left Julian shortly thereafter, headed for the Silver Strikes in Nevada. Katherine could scarcely believe the relief his departure brought. For the first time in years, she could walk through town without fear, greeting neighbors who had begun to accept her as one of their own. Mrs. Hanson had become a dear friend, often stopping by the cabin with freshly baked bread or simply to chat by the fire. And then there was Bryce Porter. Their professional relationship had gradually evolved into something warmer, though still marked by the careful politeness they both maintained. He would sometimes accompany her home after work, especially if the weather was poor, and occasionally stayed for the simple supper she offered. During these quiet meals, Katherine learned more about the man who had changed her life so dramatically. He had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher and a blacksmith. His father had died when Bryce was 16, leaving him to support his mother and younger sister. When the war came, he had enlisted in the Union Army, rising to the rank of captain before a minor wound sent him home in the final months of the conflict. It was then he discovered his sister's tragic fate, setting him on a path that eventually led to California. "I needed a fresh start," he explained one evening as they sat before the fire, snow falling gently outside. "Somewhere I could build something worthwhile." "And have you?" Katherine asked. "Built something worthwhile, I mean." Porter gazed into the flames, contemplative. "I've built a successful business, provided jobs for men who need them, tried to use what influence I have for good." He looked up at her. "But there are days I wonder if it's enough." "I think it is," Katherine said softly. "What you did for me, it was more than enough." His eyes, reflecting the firelight, held hers for a long moment before he stood, breaking the spell. "It's getting late. I should head back to town before the snow gets worse." Katherine walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "Be careful on the road." He paused on the threshold, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Katherine," he said, using her given name for the first time, "there's a Christmas social at the church next Saturday evening. Would you consider attending with me?" Her heart quickened at the unexpected invitation. "As your employee?" she asked carefully. "As my friend," he replied, then added more quietly, "or perhaps as something more if you're willing." The honesty in his voice gave her courage. "I would like that very much, Bryce." His smile was worth the boldness of using his first name. "Good. I'll call for you at 6. He hesitated, then leaned down and placed the gentlest of kisses on her cheek. "Good night, Katherine." Long after he had gone, Katherine stood at the window, watching the snow swirl in the darkness, her fingers touching the spot where his lips had brushed her skin. The Christmas social at Julian's small white steepled church was the highlight of the town's holiday season. Pine boughs and red ribbons decorated the community hall, and lanterns cast a warm glow over the gathering. Nearly everyone in Julian and the surrounding homesteads had turned out, dressed in their finest clothes and bringing dishes for the communal supper. Katherine had spent hours preparing for the evening, washing her hair with the lavender-scented soap. Mrs. Hanson had given her, and pressing her best dress, a deep green wool with a modest lace collar. It was far from the fashionable gown she had once worn in San Francisco, but she felt pretty in it nonetheless. When Bryce arrived to escort her, the appreciation in his eyes confirmed her efforts had been worthwhile. He himself cut a striking figure in a dark suit and crisp white shirt, his usually unruly brown hair neatly combed. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. The social was already in full swing when they arrived. Children darted between the adults, playing tag around the tables laden with food. A small group of musicians played lively tunes in one corner, while in another, the minister and his wife served hot cider and encouraged donations for the church roof fund. Katherine felt a moment of apprehension as they entered. Despite her months in Julian, this was her first major social event, and she was acutely aware of arriving on Bryce Porter's arm, a man many considered the most eligible bachelor in the county. "Everyone is staring," she whispered. Bryce squeezed her hand where it rested in the crook of his elbow. "Let them stare. We have nothing to be ashamed of." Indeed, after the initial curious glances, they were warmly welcomed. The minister's wife, Mrs. Collins, embraced Katherine like an old friend. "We've been hoping you would join us for services. Mrs. Newman. Mr. Porter tells us you play the piano beautifully. Our little church organ has been silent since Miss Jenkins married and moved to San Diego last spring." Before Katherine could respond, they were approached by a distinguished older couple. "Bryce, my boy," the gentleman said heartily. "Aren't you going to introduce us to your lovely companion?" Bryce smiled. "Judge and Mrs. Franklin, may I present Mrs. Katherine Newman?" "Katherine, Judge Franklin is one of Julian's founding citizens, and Mrs. Franklin is responsible for organizing this wonderful event. Pleased to meet you, my dear, Mrs. Franklin said, studying Katherine with kind but assessing eyes. We've heard quite a bit about you from Bryce. He speaks very highly of your skills with numbers. Katherine has revolutionized my accounting system, Bryce confirmed. I should have hired a banker's daughter years ago. The judge chuckled. Smart and beautiful. No wonder you've been keeping her to yourself, Porter. He winked at Katherine. This young man has been the target of every matchmaking mother in 3 counties, you know. Katherine felt her cheeks warm, but Bryce just laughed. And I've managed to evade them all until now. The comment, casual as it was, sent a ripple of pleasure through Katherine. The evening continued in a pleasant blur of introductions, conversation, and delicious food. Bryce stayed close by her side, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd, a protective gesture that made her feel both safe and cherished. As the evening progressed, the musicians struck up a waltz and couples began to take to the small dance floor. "May I have this dance?" Bryce asked, holding out his hand. Katherine hesitated only briefly. "It's been years since I've danced." "I'll lead," he promised. And lead he did, with a confidence and grace that surprised her. His hand at her waist was respectful but firm as he guided her through the steps. They moved in perfect harmony, as if they had danced together 100 times before. "Where did you learn to waltz, Mr. Porter?" She teased, momentarily forgetting they were surrounded by most of Julian's population. "Military balls," he replied with a smile. "Even in wartime there were moments of civility, and you dance beautifully." "My father insisted on dancing lessons. He said a banker's daughter should be accomplished in all the social graces." Bryce's expression grew serious. "He would be proud of you, Katherine. Not many women could have endured what you did and emerged with such strength and dignity." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more past the sudden tightness in her throat. They danced in silence for a while, lost in the music and the moment. Katherine was aware of admiring glances from other dancers, but for once, she didn't mind being the center of attention. In Bryce's arms, she felt confident and protected in a way she had never experienced before. As the evening drew to a close, they joined the other townspeople in singing Christmas carols around the piano, which Katherine was persuaded to play for the final song, "Silent Night." Her fingers moved confidently over the keys, muscle memory returning from her years of lessons, and when she finished, the applause was genuine and warm. The ride home through the winter night was magical. Bryce had brought a sleigh instead of a wagon, complete with bells that jingled merrily as the horses trotted through the snow-covered landscape. Wrapped in blankets against the cold, Katherine felt a happiness she had almost forgotten was possible. When they reached her cabin, Bryce helped her from the sleigh and walked her to the door. The moon cast long shadows across the snow, and their breath made clouds in the frigid air. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Katherine said, suddenly shy as they stood facing each other on her porch. "It was my pleasure," Bryce replied. "Though I should warn you, after tonight there will be talk about us. Julian is a small town and people notice things, like how I couldn't take my eyes off you all evening." His voice was low, intimate in the darkness. Katherine's heart raced. "And would that talk bother you?" "Not at all." He stepped closer. "The question is, would it bother you?" She thought of the life she had led before the fear, the shame, the isolation. And she thought of the past months, the growing confidence, the sense of purpose, and most of all, the feeling she had developed for the man standing before her. "No," she said softly. "It wouldn't bother me." Bryce's hand came up to gently cup her cheek. "Katherine," he murmured, "may I kiss you?" She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion welling within her. His lips met hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Not the harsh, demanding kisses Thaddeus had forced upon her in their rare, intimate moments, but something reverent and sweet that spoke of respect as much as desire. When they parted, Bryce rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first moment I saw you," he confessed. "In the saloon." Katherine couldn't help but laugh softly. "I was hardly at my best that night." "You were beautiful and brave," he corrected her. "And I knew then that you were someone special." He kissed her again, more deeply this time, and Katherine felt herself responding with a passion she had never known she possessed. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I should go," Bryce said reluctantly, "before I forget myself entirely." Katherine nodded, though part of her wished he would stay. "Will I see you tomorrow?" "Try to keep me away," he smiled, kissing her once more briefly before stepping back. "Sweet dreams, Katherine." She watched from the doorway as he drove away, the sleigh bells fading into the night. Inside her cabin, she touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss, and knew that her life had changed once again this time, by her own choice. The weeks following the Christmas social were the happiest of Katherine's life. Her relationship with Bryce blossomed in the cold, clear days of winter, their courtship conducted with a proper respect for convention that nonetheless did nothing to diminish the growing passion between them. They attended church together on Sundays, where Katherine had indeed taken over playing the small organ, much to the congregation's delight. Weekday evenings often found Bryce at her cabin for supper, or Katherine joining him at his ranch house outside of town, chaperoned by his housekeeper, Mrs. Gunderson, a Norwegian widow with a talent for cooking and a kind heart. January gave way to February, and with it came Valentine's Day. Bryce had been called away to San Diego on business, but promised to return in time for the holiday. Katherine spent the day preparing a special meal and had just set the table when a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Bryce standing on the porch, his horse still saddled behind him, snow dusting his shoulders. In his arms was an enormous bouquet of hothouse roses, clearly brought at great expense from the city. "Happy Valentine's Day," he said, presenting her with the flowers. "They're beautiful," Katherine exclaimed, burying her face in the fragrant blooms. "Come in before you freeze." Bryce stomped the snow from his boots and entered, removing his coat. As Katherine arranged the roses in a pitcher, he moved to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "I missed you," he murmured against her hair. She turned in his embrace. "I missed you too." His kiss was hungry after their separation, and Katherine responded with equal fervor. They had been careful to maintain proper boundaries in their courtship, mindful of her vulnerable position as a woman whose marital status was somewhat ambiguous. But in moments like these, alone in the privacy of her cabin, it was increasingly difficult to remember why such caution was necessary. Bryce was the one who finally pulled away, his breathing uneven. "Katherine," he said, taking her hands in his, "there's something I need to ask you." She looked up at him, hope rising in her chest. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I had planned a much more romantic proposal, but I find I can't wait another moment." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "Katherine Newman, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy sprang to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." Bryce slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. His kisses rained down on her face, her eyes, her cheeks, her lips, until they were both laughing and crying at once. When he finally set her down, his expression grew more serious. "There's something else I need to tell you. I received news in San Diego about Thaddeus. Catherine's happiness faltered. What about him? Bryce led her to the sofa and sat beside her, still holding her hands. He's dead, Katherine. There was a bar fight in a mining camp near Virginia City. He was stabbed. The news hit her with unexpected force. Despite everything Thaddeus had done, despite the pain he had caused her, she had never wished him dead. I'm sorry, she said softly. Not for myself, but for the man he might have been if the drink hadn't ruined him. Bryce squeezed her hands. You have more compassion than most would in your position. She looked down at the diamond sparkling on her finger. What does this mean for us, legally speaking? Am I a widow now? According to the law, yes. I took the liberty of speaking with Judge Franklin before I left for San Diego. The documentation of Thaddeus's death has been filed with the county clerk. You're free to marry again whenever you wish. Relief washed over her. While she had been prepared to wait, to navigate whatever legal complexities might arise from her unusual situation, the knowledge that there would be no obstacles to their marriage was a blessing she hadn't expected. Then I wish to marry you as soon as possible, Bryce Porter, she declared. His smile was radiant. How does Easter Sunday sound? That gives us just enough time to plan a proper wedding and for spring to arrive. Easter Sunday sounds perfect, Katherine agreed. She leaned forward to kiss him again, marveling at how life could change so dramatically in the span of a few months. From the darkest moment of despair in Whitley's saloon to this pinnacle of joy in the home Bryce had given her, her journey had been nothing short of miraculous. As if reading her thoughts, Bryce said, Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been in that saloon that night. Katherine touched his face tenderly. I believe God puts people in our path when we need them most. You were there because you were meant to be. He turned his face to kiss her palm. Then I thank God for guiding me to you, Katherine Newman, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making you happy. You already do, she whispered, leaning into his embrace as the fire crackled and the winter night deepened around their sanctuary of love. The town of Julian had never seen a more beautiful bride than Katherine Newman on that Easter Sunday in 1879. The little church was filled to capacity, fragrant with spring blossoms that decorated every pew and windowsill. Outside, the mountains were turning green with new life, as if nature itself was celebrating the union about to take place. Katherine stood in the small antechamber of the church, Mrs. Hanson fussing with the veil that crowned her carefully arranged auburn hair. Her wedding dress, ordered from San Francisco at Bryce's insistence, was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate lace, far more elegant than anything Julian's dressmaker could have created. You look absolutely radiant, my dear, Mrs. Hanson said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Bryce won't be able to take his eyes off you. Katherine smiled, her happiness too great for words. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation, the entire town seeming to rally around their wedding plans. Judge Franklin had insisted on hosting the reception at his spacious home. Mrs. Franklin and the ladies of the church had been cooking for days. Even Jasper Whitley, perhaps seeking to make amends for his role in her past troubles, had donated his finest champagne for the toasts. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Williams, the town physician who had become a father figure to Katherine and had agreed to give her away. It's time, my dear, he said, offering his arm. And may I say, you are a vision that would make any father proud. Katherine took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. Thank you for doing this, Doctor. It means more than I can say. The honor is mine, he replied warmly. Now, let's not keep that fine man of yours waiting any longer. The music swelled as the church doors opened, and Katherine began her walk down the aisle on Dr. Williams's arm. The faces of friends and neighbors blurred as her eyes sought and found Bryce, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit, his expression one of such tender adoration that her heart seemed to expand in her chest. When Dr. Williams placed her hand in Bryce's and stepped aside, Katherine felt as if her life was truly beginning anew. The minister's words washed over her as she and Bryce exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for all their days. "With this ring I thee wed," Bryce said, sliding a gold band next to her engagement ring, his voice steady and sure. Katherine repeated the words as she placed a matching band on his finger, her voice clear despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Bryce lifted her veil and cupped her face with gentle hands. "I love you, Katherine Porter," he whispered, before claiming her lips in a kiss that sealed their union before God and their community. The reception at the Franklin estate was a joyous celebration that lasted well into the evening. Katherine and Bryce moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like every resident of Julian County. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit in the garden, casting a magical glow over the festivities. Bryce led Katherine to the center of the makeshift dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife, holding her close as the musicians played a romantic waltz. "Happy, Mrs. Porter," he murmured against her ear. "Completely," she answered, looking up into the face of the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "And you, more than I ever thought possible." His blue eyes, so serious in their first meetings, now crinkled at the corners with joy. "I have something to tell you." "What is it?" "I've bought the Newman farm from Whitley." Katherine missed a step, surprised. "Why would you do that?" "Because it adjoins my ranch property, and because I thought you might like to decide what happens to it." He smiled at her confusion. "We could work the land or sell it or donate it to the church for their proposed orphanage. Whatever you want, Katherine, it's yours to decide." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. "The orphanage," she said without hesitation. "Those children deserve a good home with land to run and play on." Bryce nodded, his expression tender. "I thought you might say that. I'll speak to Reverend Collins tomorrow." As the dance ended, Judge Franklin approached with a document in hand. "I thought you might want this as a wedding present," he said, handing the paper to Katherine. It was the deed to her cabin and the 5 acres surrounding it. But now it bore both her name and Bryce's, officially recognizing their union in property as well as matrimony. "Thank you, Judge," Katherine said, deeply touched by the gesture. The older man patted her hand. "No need for thanks, my dear. It's just making official what we all already know, that you two belong together." As the evening drew to a close, Bryce and Katherine said their goodbyes and departed in a carriage decorated with ribbons and flowers, to the cheers and well wishes of their friends. They were bound not for her cabin or his ranch house, but for the elegant Julian Hotel, where Bryce had reserved the finest suite for their wedding night. Later, as they lay entwined in the luxurious bed, Katherine rested her head on her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I still can't quite believe it," she murmured. "That night in the saloon seems like a lifetime ago." Bryce's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "In many ways it was. We're different people now." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Do you ever regret it?" "Giving me that deed, taking responsibility for a woman you didn't even know?" "Never," he said firmly, pulling her closer. "From the moment I saw you, something inside me knew you were meant to be part of my life. I just had to find a way to make it happen." Katherine settled back against him, contentment washing over her like a warm tide. "Then I'm glad you did." "So am I, Mrs. Porter," Bryce replied, his voice husky with emotion. "So am I." 5 years later, April 1884, the sound of children's laughter carried on the spring breeze as Katherine Porter sat on the wide porch of the Porter Ranch house, a basket of mending at her feet. She watched with a smile as Bryce lifted their 3-year-old son, William, onto the back of a gentle pony, holding him securely while the boy squealed with delight. Nearby, their daughter Grace, just turned 5, was carefully collecting eggs from the henhouse under the watchful eye of Mrs. Gunderson, who had remained with them as both housekeeper and beloved surrogate grandmother to the children. The ranch had prospered under Bryce's careful management, expanding to include not only cattle, but also orchards of apple and pear trees that were beginning to make Julian famous throughout Southern California. Katherine continued to manage the financial side of both the ranch and Bryce's mining interests, though now she did most of her work from the spacious office Bryce had built for her in their home, allowing her to be near the children. Their original cabin, where Katherine had first found independence and where they had spent the early months of their marriage, still stood on the property. They had preserved it as a guest house, though Katherine sometimes went there alone when she needed quiet moments to write in her journal or simply reflect on the journey that had brought her to this abundant life. The former Newman farm had indeed become the site of the Julian Orphanage, a thriving institution that now housed 12 children under the care of Reverend Collins and his wife. Katherine served on the board and visited weekly to teach music to the children, many of whom had become like extended family. Julian itself had grown as well, though it retained its small-town charm. The railroad had finally reached the area the previous year, bringing new settlers and visitors to admire the mountain scenery and sample the famous Julian apple pies that had become a local specialty. Through all these changes, the bond between Katherine and Bryce had only strengthened. Their love, born in unusual circumstances and tested by the challenges of building a life together, had deepened into something so essential that Katherine could scarcely remember a time when he wasn't at the center of her world. Bryce finished the pony ride and lifted William down, the boy immediately racing toward the porch with news of his adventure. "Mama, I rode Daisy all by myself," he announced, climbing into her lap with dusty boots that Katherine knew would leave marks on her skirt, marks she couldn't bring herself to mind. "I saw my brave boy," she said, kissing his sun-warmed hair. "You're becoming quite the horseman." Bryce followed at a more sedate pace, Grace now perched on his shoulders, a basket of eggs carefully cradled in her small hands. "And how are my favorite ladies this afternoon?" he asked, setting Grace gently on the porch step. "We collected 14 eggs, Papa," Grace reported seriously. "And Mrs. Gunderson says I may help make the custard for Sunday's dinner." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Bryce said, ruffling her dark curls so like his own before turning to Katherine. "And you, my love, how are you feeling today?" His concern was warranted. At 4 months pregnant with their third child, Katherine had been experiencing more fatigue than with her previous pregnancies, though Dr. Williams assured them everything was progressing normally. "I'm well," she assured him with a smile. "Just enjoying watching my family." Bryce leaned down to kiss her, a gesture that still sent a pleasant flutter through her even after 5 years of marriage. "I have news," he said, settling onto the porch step beside Grace. "A letter came from San Francisco. Your cousin Elizabeth is finally coming for that visit she's been promising. She'll arrive on next week's train." "Oh, that's wonderful," Katherine exclaimed. Elizabeth was her only remaining family, her father's niece who had married a successful attorney in San Francisco. Though they corresponded regularly, they hadn't seen each other since before Catherine's marriage to Thaddeus. The children will be so excited to meet her. And there's more, Bryce continued, a mysterious smile playing at his lips. Judge Franklin stopped by the office this morning. It seems the town council has decided to name the new schoolhouse after a certain lady who has contributed greatly to the educational opportunities in Julian through her work with the orphanage and her donation of books to the library. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. The Katherine Porter schoolhouse. Bryce, you didn't. I had nothing to do with it, he assured her, eyes twinkling. Though I heartily approve, the dedication ceremony will be next month and the judge insists you must give a speech. A speech, Katherine laughed. What would I possibly say? Perhaps you could tell them about the power of second chances, Bryce suggested, reaching for her hand. Or about how sometimes the worst moment of your life can lead to the best if you have the courage to keep going. Katherine squeezed his fingers, thinking of that terrible night in Whitley's saloon, and how the darkest hour had indeed preceded the dawn of a new life she could never have imagined. Maybe I will, she said softly. The children, growing restless with adult conversation, scampered off to help Mrs. Gunderson prepare the afternoon snack, leaving Bryce and Katherine alone on the porch. He moved to sit beside her on the swing, his arm slipping around her shoulders in a familiar, comfortable gesture. Do you ever think about him? Bryce asked quietly. Thaddeus, Katherine considered the question. In the early days of their marriage, she had occasionally awakened from nightmares about her first husband, but those had faded over time, replaced by dreams of the future rather than fears from the past. Sometimes, she admitted. Not with anger anymore, just a kind of sadness for what might have been if he'd made different choices. And gratitude, in an odd way. Gratitude, Bryce looked surprised. If he hadn't been the man he was, if he hadn't done what he did that night, I might never have found you. She touched his face gently, and that would have been the real tragedy. Bryce turned his head to kiss her palm, a gesture that had become a cherished part of their private language over the years. I think I would have found you somehow, even if it took longer, even if the path was different. Some things are just meant to be. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, Katherine leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, watching their children play in the golden light. From the darkest moment of her life had come this abundance of love, security, and purpose, a life beyond anything she could have dreamed when she stood trembling in a saloon, being bartered away for bottles of whiskey. Bryce had given her more than a deed to land that night. He had given her the deed to her own life, the freedom to choose her own path, and she had chosen him every day since. I love you, Bryce Porter, she said simply, the words as true now as the first time she had spoken them. And I love you, Katherine, he replied, his voice carrying the depth of feeling that had only grown stronger through the years of building a life together. Always. As the sun set over the mountains surrounding Julian, casting the valley in hues of gold and purple, the Porter family gathered around their dinner table. Bryce and Katherine, their children, Mrs. Gunderson, and two of the older orphan boys who now worked part-time on the ranch. Grace said the blessing, her young voice solemn as she thanked God for family and home, for the food before them, and for the new baby who would join them in the summer. Katherine looked around at the faces illuminated by candlelight, the family she and Bryce had created together, and felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. From property to be traded at a man's whim, she had become the beloved heart of this home, this family, this community. The deed Bryce had given her that fateful night now hung, framed in their parlor, a reminder of beginnings, of turning points, of the moment when despair had transformed into hope. But the true deed, the one that mattered most, was written not on paper but in the love they shared. A love that had built not just a home but a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was, Katherine reflected as Bryce's hand found hers beneath the table, the most precious deed of all.